Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's WaterCARE community conversation. This is our second conversation. This one is going to have a focus on asset management. One bit of information before we move on to letting Melissa Kramer speak is just to let you know that the next WaterCARE community conversations will take place on June 19th and September 19th. The topic for June 19th will be affordability and funding programs. The topic for September 19th will be customer communication and rate communication, and both of those will take place at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And I know it's a little bit late for the folks on the East Coast, but because we have so many time zones across the country, including Alaska, it just makes it a little bit easier to choose that time to get everybody a decent time across the country. So I apologize for the fact that it's a little bit late on the East Coast, but it does make it a little bit easier for as we head west across the country. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Melissa Kramer, and she'll talk about potential assistance from the EPA Office of Sustainable Communities. And Melissa, would you like to show your screen, or do you just have a discussion today?
Yeah, I don't have any slides, so you could just
okay,
leave
great.
that picture up there. So thanks, Heather. Yeah, this is just an initial idea that we have been exploring with our colleagues in the WaterCARE program that I wanted to talk to folks about to see if there was any interest in this was something that was worthwhile for us to pursue. In the Office of Sustainable Communities, just to give you a little bit of background on where we're coming from, is we help communities create land use and development policies in ways that help them expand economic opportunity while protecting human health and the environment. So we deal with a whole range of issues under that umbrella. The way that we usually work is through technical assistance with communities, actually a lot like the WaterCARE program works. We have several different programs under which communities apply to us for assistance on one topic or another, and then we work with them. Some of our programs are quick in and out, and some of them are more of a deeper dive. And what we've been talking about with WaterCARE is trying to do something with potentially one of the WaterCARE communities that was modeled much more along the lines of that deeper dive type of program. What we usually call it is smart growth implementation assistance. And the way that has traditionally worked is we've put out a call for folks and said, hey, these are sort of the general areas that we're thinking of exploring. What issues are you and your community dealing with right now where you could benefit from some assistance, technical expertise to try to understand this issue? And then when we go about selecting communities, one of the things that we're looking for is an issue that we consider to be kind of on the cutting edge, so that through the course of providing the assistance, we learn something ourselves and we can create a tool or a document or something that's then useful for other communities across the country that are dealing with very similar type of issues. So what we've been talking about with the WaterCARE program is really trying to
muted
in costs or potentially achieve greater equity of costs within a community. And so, we understand that you're dealing with a spectrum of issues across all of the communities that are out there, and so we're trying to just gauge whether there's anybody out there who's interested in exploring that side of things, because that's really where we come to the table from, is just to try to understand, hey, do you have the right folks at the table to think about land use policies and codes and ordinances and things that maybe some people don't necessarily think right off the bat are having an impact on your water rates, but we know, or we at least expect, that as communities development starts to spread out and become more dispersed, that the cost for the infrastructure and the cost to deliver that service necessarily is going to go up for the system as a whole, and sometimes for then the individual ratepayers. So I guess one thing I can point to is a project that we did do under the Smart Growth Implementation Assistance Program that was with the Spokane tribe of Indians. That this was, perhaps not exactly what we're talking about here, but I think it does sort of illustrate the kind of scope of what we're intending to do. In this case, you had a tribe that was looking to promote economic development. They recognized and fully supported the idea of having additional development in their sort of core downtown area, but their water infrastructure really wouldn't allow any additional development to occur there. So they were looking for long-term solutions that would help them achieve their development goals while at the same time addressing really serious water quality issues that they had. And so we brought in some technical experts that looked at what were some of the technical things that they might do to try to address basically the need for an additional development in the downtown area, and then did explore that whole range of issues around, well, what are the other policies that you have in place right now that are incentivizing this sort of dispersed development that makes it very difficult to create an economically vibrant downtown? What are some of the implications of that development for your water infrastructure, for your town as a whole? And so we ultimately had a workshop on site there with the community and really came up with a long-term plan and a vision for the community of how they might start to shift some of what they were doing to achieve the whole range of goals across economic development, environmental protection, and water delivery and service. So I don't know what the best way is for folks to try who are interested, and I think at this point it's really so early on. We don't know whether we will be able to do this, and so we really need to flesh it out a little bit more in order to be able to make the case to try to get the funding to do it. And so I think probably the first step that I would want to go through with anyone who was interested would be just to have a conversation, just to talk on the phone and just understand a little bit about what the issues are that you're dealing with, to see if there might be something worth looking into. And again, we don't know how many communities we might be able to help. If there were, for example, two communities looking at very similar issues, there might be an opportunity to kind of combine an assistance project in both. So I think really everything's on the table right now, and I guess I just need some mechanism for folks to get in touch with me. As I said, probably an initial phone call is the best way, or an email. I don't know, Heather, what's the best mechanism to just sort of get folks my contact information so that if there is an interest, we can follow up.
Yeah, we can disperse your contact information across the whole group, and then I think if anybody has a question right now or any thoughts right now, please raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can ask Melissa anything you want, and then we'll make sure to get your name, phone number, email, all that stuff out to the whole group in WaterCARE, those that are on plus those that are not on the phone today, and just allow them to get back in touch with you if they have any questions about anything. So anybody, is there anybody on the phone now that has a question or comment for Melissa, or any thoughts about what you might want? Okay, it doesn't look like we're having any hands raised right now. Oops, okay. Stacy Brazer is going to ask a question, so go ahead, Stacy.
Oh, yeah. Hi, Heather. This is Stacy Isaac Brazer from the EFC at UNC. I wanted to just mention to Melissa that there's a little bit of a connection already. The Selma community is part of Selma to Montgomery, Alabama project, the trail project that is already a sustainable community, making a visible difference community. So there's a little bit of overlap there already.
Right, right. And we'd be interested in exploring further how we can kind of dive more deeply into these sorts of the intersection between water financing, water rate policy, and land use.
Right.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much, Melissa, for sharing, and we will be sure to get your contact out to everybody and make sure that they have a chance to pursue, any questions, comments, thoughts with you to see if we can't make any more connections between the two programs. So thank you very much for being here today.
Sure, thank you. If it's all right, then I'm just going to disconnect. So, but thank you very much for having me on today, and I hope to talk to as many people who's interested later on.
Sounds great. Thank you. And
Bye-bye.
I want to mention that there's some EPA folks who I didn't get to introduce at the beginning. We didn't have their names, so I'm just going to run down the list. We had Vince Gallo, Stephanie Hammett, Dwayne Robertson, Glenn Curtis, Michael Shaw, and Sonia Brubaker. So sorry for missing you guys the first time around. So welcome. I'm glad you're here. And again, I apologize for missing you when we went through our initial hellos. So with that, we're going to move on to the topic for today, which is asset management. And just because asset management sometimes means slightly different things to different people, I wanted to make sure we were sort of all on the same page about what asset management was before we have our discussion of some of the activities going on in the communities. So if you operate or manage a water or wastewater system, you have a lot of competing priorities. There's a lot of things that you have to do. You have to do maintenance activities, you have to react to problems, deal with customers, deal with regulations, certification, budgeting, rate setting, all kinds of things. And asset management is really designed to help you determine how to focus your efforts, your resources, your time, and best allocate those to those competing priorities. Nobody has enough money really to do everything that they would like to do with all of their assets all of the time, so you have to make choices. And you're always making choices of if I do A, I can't do B, or if I do C, I can't do D. So what we're really looking at is how do you decide whether it's A or B that you should be doing, or should you do half of A and half of B? How should you spread your time and money around? And asset management is designed to help you make data-driven decisions around those kinds of questions. So asset management has 5 basic core components, and the first is the current state of the assets. And in this component, we deal with what do we physically have that makes up our utility, because you can't really manage if you don't know what you have. The second component is level of service. This is where we get into looking at what we want our assets to do, because again, it's very hard to manage our assets if we don't know what we're managing them to do. The third component is criticality, and this is where we look at those components of our system that are most necessary to keep the facility functioning on a day-to-day basis and over time, looking at where the highest risk is within our utility. The fourth component is life cycle costing. Life cycle costing involves both operation and maintenance and the long-term repair, replacement, rehabilitation of our assets. So this gets into how are we going to manage the assets over their life. And then finally, how are we going to fund our assets, fund the management of our assets, both on a day-to-day basis and a long-term basis. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into each of these core components. So the first one is the current state of the assets. And so we want to look at what assets make up our facility. So what are those physical things, the hydrants, the valves, the pumps, the manholes, the pipe, tanks, all of that sort of thing that makes up our physical system. And then we want to know where those assets are. And we actually have 2 different issues here. We have assets that are in the field that we call our horizontal assets, and then we have assets that are our treatment assets that are in buildings or in treatment locations. The assets that are in the field, we would like some kind of map that would be able to identify where those assets are physically located, so that if we needed to go out and find a pipe or find a hydrant or find a valve, we would know exactly where to go to find it. And the assets that are related to our treatment facilities, we call those vertical assets. And in that case, we just need to know what building they're in or what facility they're associated with, what treatment facility, so that we can assign those assets to a particular place. Next, we want to know what condition our assets are in. Our assets might be in great condition, they might be in poor condition, they might be in average condition. And we want to know what condition they're in because that will help us determine the probability of failure, as well as how much longer those assets will remain in service and what kind of activities maintenance-wise we might have to do. So it's important for us to sort of rank the condition of each of our assets. Then we want to know the remaining useful life. So if we have an asset, it will decay over time in some pattern. In this case, we've just put pretty simple decay curve. That's that orange line you see on the screen. So the asset goes in, it's at its highest condition, and then it starts to decay over time. At some point, it hits our minimal acceptable service level, which is that blue dotted line. So at some point, it will no longer do what we want. And if you think about it as like a valve, when a valve stops opening and closing, it no longer does what we want. Or if a hydrant isn't able to flow enough water to serve as a hydrant, for firefighting purposes or something like that, it no longer does what we want. So if you look at the first vertical red line, the one furthest to the left, that's where we are today. And the question is, how much longer will it be until that asset no longer does what we want? So that's the remaining useful life, the time between where we are today and when the asset will no longer do what we want. So we're trying to estimate the useful life of each of our assets. Is it 5 years, 10 years, 1 year? How much longer will those assets last? Then we want to look at what the asset replacement value is. So if we have an asset like a meter and we want to replace it with something, what will it cost to replace it? And if it's a different asset, say a different kind of meter, then we want the replacement value of the new asset that we plan to put in. Or if it's, say, metallic pipe and we're going to replace it with PVC pipe, we would want to know the replacement cost of the PVC pipe. Once we get this information, we want to develop an asset inventory. We want some kind of collection of asset information that details what the assets are and characteristics about those assets. So, for example, the manufacturer, the serial number, model number, the size, the type, as well as all the other information we talked about, location, condition, that sort of thing. So there's quite a bit of information you could collect about your assets, and you need to store it somewhere. So we typically try to devise some kind of storage mechanism. It could be, if you're a very small utility, it could be done on paper, but typically it's more of a computer-based system, and maybe it's a generic database or generic spreadsheet like Excel. It could be the CUPS program that EPA has developed, or there's plenty of commercial products on the market, all different amounts of money, all different kinds of products. They'll do anything from just your inventory all the way up to ordering spare parts and anything in between. So there's plenty of commercial products. If you wanted to buy something, there is a product that would meet your needs. We also want to think about having ID numbers for each of our assets. And you can see an example of one for a valve up in the upper right-hand corner picture that allows us to identify each asset and allows us to have information about the assets in there. As we kind of mentioned before, we would like to create a system map. So a map that shows where all the assets are located in the field. We'd like it to be very user-friendly, in a technology that fits the people at your facility, and something that the operators can use, they can mark on, they can collect information. For example, where have they done line repairs, where have they exercised valves, where do they flush hydrants. Maps can be used for so many different purposes. It's such a useful tool going forward that even if you do nothing else in asset management, creating a map can save you time and effort later that will pay off tremendously. So even if you don't take on any other steps in asset management, the map is a great starting place and a really good tool to help you in the future. The second core component is level of service. And in this case, we want to think about the fact that water utilities are really customer service businesses. You're in business to serve your customers. If they weren't there, you wouldn't need to exist. The main purpose of you existing is to provide a service to your customers. And in asset management terms, we call this customer service level of service, and it really defines the major goals of the utility. It's going to define what the level of service the utility is going to provide its customers. So what are the things that you're focused on? What are those activities you're going to do, and what are the target levels you're trying to meet? Because the level of service is oftentimes very difficult for communities to understand, we have developed at the Southwest EFC a level of service guide that is available on our website, and I'll show you later on where you can access this. And it lists all the major goals that a utility would probably set, and these are kind of standard for big and small utilities kind of all across the country. And we've set the goals in words with grayed out boxes where we have target levels, and each utility can choose its own target level for the goals. But it's a really easy way to get started with goal setting, where you just pick and choose which goals best fit your system, and then put in the target levels that you want, and then you're good to go with, you know, setting level of service for your community. The third component is criticality. In criticality, we address two things. What is the likelihood that an asset will fail, and what's the consequence if it does? So will it happen, and if it does, how much do I care? And the way we want to look at it is, if you look at this quad chart here, the probability of an asset failing getting worse as you go to the right, and the consequence of an asset failing getting worse as you go up to the top, any asset that would fall in the upper right-hand box is a very high-risk asset. These are assets that have a high probability of failure as well as a high consequence. So if it happened, it would be really bad, and there's a high likelihood it's going to happen. So for example, if you had a storage tank that was already leaning and it was looking like it was going to fall over, so it had a high probability of failure, and losing your storage tank has a very high consequence of failure because you may put your whole town out of water, you may not be able to have fire flow, there may be public health consequences, so that would be a very high consequence item, so that would be a high-risk asset. The assets that are in the bottom left-hand corner, the low-risk assets, are those that have a very low probability they will fail, and even if they do, we're not very concerned about it. The reason we look at assets in this way, where we're looking at low risk, high risk, and then we have two moderate risk boxes, one box being high probability of failure but low consequence, and the other box being low probability of failure but high consequence if it did happen, is we want to spend our money in a different way. The more we can spend our money on the high risk assets and reducing the risk of the overall risk of our facility, the better off we're going to be. So if we spend our money more on the high risk and less on the low risk assets, we'll have a better operation, better service for our customers, and we can have more impact with the same amount of money. The fourth component is life cycle costing. So in life cycle costing, I like to think about it as a balance where we're balancing operation and maintenance, repair activities against replacement. Typically speaking, replacement is the most expensive option. So if something is failing, if something is has some break in it, if we have to replace the whole thing, it's going to cost us a whole lot more than if we can just maintain it or repair it. So we typically try to balance so that we're doing more on the operation and maintenance side and less on the replacement side, because it would be cheaper for us to be more heavily weighted on the maintenance side and less heavily on the replacement side. So one sort of analogy would be if you have a car and it gets a flat tire, it's a whole lot cheaper to fix the flat tire than to replace the car. So we wouldn't want to replace the car because it had a flat tire. We would want to just fix the tire. Well, similarly, in our treatment facilities, if we have a long ductile iron pipe, for example, and it gets a hole in the middle of it, rather than replacing the whole pipe, we would just want to do something to repair that break. So maybe put a clamp on it or something like that, so that our pipe is fixed rather than having to replace it. If we think back to our risk discussion, we kind of bring that into this whole balance equation, and if it's an asset that is likely to fail and it's a really high consequence, we'll probably be more on the replacement side. If it's a low-risk asset, we'll probably be more on the maintenance and repair side. So we can bring our risk into our discussion about how we balance maintenance against replacement. When we look at maintenance activities, I usually put them into 3 categories, but there's nothing magic about these categories. Some people split it up a little bit differently. But I like to think of the routine activities that you would do every day to operate and maintain your assets. And these are the things you just have to do to keep things in proper operating order, make sure your system runs. The next kind of maintenance activities are preventative maintenance. So you see something starting to go towards a failure mode and you intervene to prevent that from happening. So if you see the roof of your pump house start to get a small hole in it, rather than waiting for it to get a big hole and the whole thing collapse, what you'd want to do is fix it while it's a small hole so that we prevent the entire collapse of the roof. The last kind is predictive, where we're trying to get in with tools and techniques to try to predict when the asset is going to fail. So this might be looking at a pump and maybe you do a thermal analysis, or maybe you do a wear test on the lubricant that's in the pump. And you're trying to use that to predict when the failure of the pump might actually occur. Do I have, another year, 2 years, 6 years, 10 years? Or it might be looking at your storage tank, putting a diver in your storage tank or putting a robot in your storage tank to look at what's happening inside to predict how much longer you have on that storage tank before it's going to need some serious repairs or maintenance. Part of the whole life cycle costing is to develop your operation and maintenance plan, what activities you want to do when, and really look at things like what are the maintenance activities I do now that I should continue to do, what don't I do now that I should start doing, trying to figure out which activities you do now that you shouldn't do, because a lot of times we think we're doing the right maintenance, but we're not. We either are on the wrong schedule or we're doing more maintenance than we should in some areas and less than we should in other areas. We have a tendency to want to maintain assets we can see a lot more than assets we can't. So sometimes we ignore the assets that are underground, like our wells and our pipes and our valves, and we spend a lot more time on our pump stations and treatment facilities, things that we can see and touch and experience more. So we have to really think about how to best split up our maintenance tasks. Since we can't do everything we want, where best to put our effort. On the opposite side, once we have a failure of an asset, we have to decide what we want to do about it. And we have 3 options anytime an asset's in a failure mode. We can repair it, we can rehabilitate it, or we can replace it. So typically, when we have all of these options, repair options tend to be on the cheaper side. That's not always true. But generally speaking, repair would be on the cheaper side. Rehabilitation would be in between, and replacement would be the most expensive. We don't always have rehabilitation options, but anytime we're in the mode where we want to replace an asset, we need to look at all 3 options and see what makes the most sense for us. We also, out of this portion of asset management, want to develop a long-term capital improvement plan. What do we need to do in terms of replacement for our assets over time? And we want to think really long-term. So 50 to 100 years, what needs to happen to our facility? And in the course of 100 years, you're likely to replace everything in your treatment facility. So the long-term capital plan looking at 100 years would be pretty much addressing everything in your facility. So you could see the long-term arc of what you have to spend to keep the facility running. Finally, long-term funding. We need to think about what our funding needs are on a day-to-day basis for the operation and maintenance of the facility, and then long-term for the capital expenditures of our facility. Because we can get different sources of funding, we kind of have to look at those two needs differently. So the day-to-day funding is pretty much all going to be borne by the community. So it has to be taxes, fees, user charges, something along those lines. And then for our capital, sometimes we can have outside funding. We may choose to use a reserve account or something like that, but we're also going to be able to access things like the state revolving fund or the USDA funds, or at least for now the community development block grant funds, things like that will help us pay for that infrastructure. What we like to think about when we're looking at funding is it's about the story and how we tell it. So why do you need the money? What is it for? What is the risk if you don't get the money? What's the benefit if you do? And really tell the story in the best way possible. And story in a good way. This is about how to explain through data, through your customers' needs, etc. You know, why you need that money, what it's for, and how it benefits your community and your customers. One other aspect of asset management that I wanted to bring in that's not directly one of the 5 core components, but is definitely an underlying piece of asset management, is knowledge management or knowledge transfer. How we transfer knowledge from one person or a couple of people in the organization to others in the organization. And this comes in particular importance when we have operators, managers, directors, etc., who have a wealth of knowledge about facilities and who may be leaving the facility, and how do you pass that information on to others, because you don't want to lose that wealth of knowledge. So how do we gain information about, you know, how to do a particular task, or where an asset is located, or how you maintain something, or maybe they've spent a bunch of time figuring out the best way to change a lubricant and you want to share that knowledge with others. So we want to think about, you know, how to best transfer that knowledge, what approach, what kind of knowledge, and who needs to be involved in the process. Now I want to just talk a little bit about the benefits of asset management. You know, why would you want to take this on at all? It sounds like a lot of work. Why would I want to do this? One benefit is work efficiency. If you have a map like we described before and you have a lot of knowledge about your assets, you know how the valves connect to your pipe, you know which valves to shut off to have a certain pipe shut down, you can really reduce the field time. You're not having to look for assets, you're not having to figure out how they connect, you can respond to emergencies faster, etc. So work efficiency is one good reason. Financial efficiency is another one. If you invest in your preventative maintenance program, you'll have fewer accidents, more efficient operation and service, and a more sustainable utility. So we often look at paying for maintenance as a negative, but investing in maintenance will pay off in long-term savings. So it actually will pay for itself over the long term if you're able to invest in routine and preventative maintenance. Another reason to do asset management is dealing with natural disasters. If you know where your assets are, it certainly helps you to find them in a disaster. Sometimes, you know, if you have a tornado, debris may be over top of some of your assets, or if you have a bad flood and debris gets put on top of your wellheads or pipes, things like that, it's really hard to find them if you don't know where they are. Having a good inventory also helps you dealing with FEMA. If you're looking at FEMA funding to help you get back on your feet, they'd like to know what assets you're talking about, how many you have, that sort of thing. So the better your inventory, the better you are able to deal with that process. And maintaining your assets in good condition, replacing your high-risk assets will make you more resilient to the natural disasters to begin with. The Financial benefits, there are several of those we'll talk about. One is reducing the need for rate increases. I do not want to imply that the purpose of asset management is to take away the need for a rate increase or prevent you from having to raise your rates, because that's not what it's about. But hopefully what it can do is, as you're going forward and you're putting in the rate increases that you need to keep your facility running, sustainably for the long term, you can reduce the need for larger rate increases. Because anytime you kind of have two possibilities, you either increase the revenues you need or you decrease the cost. So asset management is kind of helping you on that decreased cost side to say, how can we look for ways to help decrease the cost of one activity that might allow that funding to be used for something else. So if maybe we're doing maintenance in the wrong place right now, or we're over-maintaining some assets, which sometimes happens, and we're under-maintaining others. We're not getting all those cost benefits out of that, so we can change how we do maintenance to help us spread our costs differently and, again, decrease the need for additional revenues. Business case evaluations are another way to reduce costs, where you look at each capital expenditure or major capital expenditures and try to determine if that's really the best alternative, the best way to do it, and try to see if you can't reduce some of those capital expenditures. It also deals with the accessing funding side. Some funders are requiring AM, asset management, or portions of asset management. Some are incentivizing it, so that's going to help you in getting the funding. Funders that see you're doing a robust asset management program are much more confident you're doing the right project and will help you get through that whole process of determining your projects and that kind of thing. And your bond rating, if you are in a situation where you have bonding, can be positively impacted if you have a robust asset management program. It can also help you with phasing projects. You probably don't have all the money you want to do the projects all at once, so you're going to have to phase the project over time. So you can use the risk portion of asset management as well as level of service to help you determine the best way to phase your project, which pieces should go first, which should go second, and that type of thing. It can also help you figure out how to invest incrementally. Many times what we look at in utilities is people go along for quite some time without investing anything, and then all of a sudden you need a huge amount of investment to put your facility back in proper working order. What we really would like to see people do is invest incrementally, pretty much continuously, so you reduce that huge spike of money that you need, say every 20 years or every 30 years, by investing a little bit at a time. It also will reduce the emergencies that you have to try to help, again, with the overall costs. Another benefit is to identify your long-term needs. So looking at, what do you need over that 50 to 100-year time frame. If you keep your CIP short 5 to 10 years, it often looks like if you just do those tasks for the 5 to 10 year period, there's nothing else that's looming. So I could put those tasks off for 5 or 10 years and it won't matter. But if you know that there's something else in year 11 or year 6, you're much less likely to do that, because you know that not only do you have to do this stuff from years 5 to 10, but there's another set of stuff from years 11 to 20 and 21 to 30, etc. So the more you can look long term, the better off you are in trying to get your elected leaders to understand the need to invest now, because you can't put it off. And you really want your community to be looking sustainably over time. Now I'd like to move into the asset management with 3 of our WaterCARE communities. There's a couple of others that will receive some or all of asset management as well, but we're just going to focus on 3 communities today. So the first one we wanted to focus on is Gatesville, Texas. So I just put a couple of pictures of Gatesville on the screen. They're a community of about 16,000 people, although about half of the residents are prison inmates. So it creates a very unique situation for the city of Gatesville, as they have 5 prisons that are served by their water and wastewater utility. So that, again, is about half the population. And so that creates some interesting dynamics in terms of revenue as well as water distribution and treatment. Gatesville has a water utility and distribution system, as well as 2 wastewater treatment plants and a collection system. One of the wastewater treatment plants has about 80% of its flow from the prison system. And then on the screen now is also just some pictures of different assets in their water and wastewater utility, just again to give you a feel for what their facilities are like. And I'd like to open it up now to have Bill Perry just say a few words about the asset management needs in Gatesville, where they're at, and that sort of thing. So James, if you can unmute Bill. Okay, Bill, I think you're able to talk to us now. If you could just talk to us for a few minutes about asset management in Gatesville.
Sure. I think Gatesville, probably like a lot of other communities, is probably the poster child for what Heather's just been talking about. In the early 1980s, Gatesville moved from getting their water from a well system to surface water, and so they made a significant investment, a very large investment, in water treatment and water distribution about 30 years ago, and then kind of said, okay, we spent the money and everything is good to go. So I've been the city manager here for going on 2 years, but I've been through 2 budget cycles. And in my first budget cycle, it became intuitively obvious to me that if we had ever done asset management, we certainly moved away from it because we were not looking at life cycle costs for the components of our water and wastewater system. And as that equipment got older, it posed a significant challenge, so that as opposed to being able to predictably budget the cost for repair and maintenance, what we ended up with was simply variable cost. And again, we were in the classic mode of we just rode the horse until the horse would go no further, and then we would spend the money on replacing a component which was significantly expensive. We had no, and still at this particular point, although we're working on it, we had no CIP. So 50 to 100 years is a great vision. I'd like to get at least the 5 to 10 year look on that so that we know what we're looking at. So about a year ago, the Texas Water Development Board put on a training class for water and wastewater system operators or managers, and walked them through the asset management practice, and I sent my water and wastewater department heads to that. They embraced it. They said, we need to do this, and it certainly gave us visibility. As Heather has indicated, we are a regional water supply. We provide water to 5 smaller communities in the area around us, to North Fort Hood, where reserve component soldiers are going through mobilization and demobilization. 6 prisons with a total combined population of about 7,700 with 2,600 employees, so they're our largest employer in the city, and then about 3,000 retail connections in the city of Gatesville. So we realized that we really didn't know what we had. We didn't realize how old it was. We had no real system in place for doing preventive maintenance or predictive maintenance, and so we basically just ran our assets until the point that the asset no longer worked. And then we replaced it if we had money that was available, but oftentimes money was always a challenge because a lot of these pieces of the infrastructure are very expensive. So that's kind of where we're at this particular point.
Great. Thank you very much for saying that. And the bad news that Bill just talked about was maybe that they don't have everything they want, but the good news is they do have a starting place. So on the screen is an example of their existing Google Earth map, and Bill likes to call it GIS Lite. So it's sort of not the full bore GIS mapping, but it has a lot of their inventory on it already. The downside right now is that when you click on an asset, there's not a whole lot of information there. So that's something that we will work with Gatesville on, is because when you click on it, just a little bit of information comes up. We have actually taken their Google Earth map and we put it into an ArcGIS map that was just created from that Google Earth, and then here's what it looks like if you zoom in on it. Again, there's not a lot of information about the particular assets, but it's pretty easy to convert it to a GIS map, and that gives you a good starting place with mapping. They also have a spreadsheet of some existing asset information from their fixed base asset inventory system, and many of you have probably done a fixed base asset management program because municipalities have had to do this. I think it varies a little bit across the country, but it's somewhere between about $3,000 or $5,000 is what constitutes an asset that would go into this program. So your major assets, maybe large pumps, pipe, tanks, things like that that are pretty expensive items would probably end up on a fixed-based asset inventory. That inventory won't have everything that we would like to collect for asset management purposes, but it certainly has a good starting place that can be expanded. And then they also have had some information. Bill mentioned the training that his folks went to that Texas put on. And it's geared for, small utilities getting started in asset management, and on the screen is one of the worksheets that came out of that program that Texas does, and his folks filled in a lot of information. Again, this may not be all the information that we would like to have, but it's a great starting place. And it gives us a really good place to sort of sink our teeth in and see where the holes are in the program and help them fill in some of the data gaps and some of the information that's missing. So the good news is there is a starting place. There are a lot of good sources to start with, and then we just need to fill in some holes to try to make it a more robust program. So activities for Gatesville, we're going to focus on that long-term capital plan and using asset management to help Gatesville come up with that long-term capital plan, having it be more robust for the first, say, 5 to 10 years, and then at least having some idea what will happen for maybe the next 11 to 50 years after that, to give some idea of the types of investments that are needed. So we'd like to add some of the missing pieces in the GIS map. There are some assets that may not be in there at all, or they may be in the wrong places. Add some missing pieces into the asset inventory, and then move from the inventory into the long-term capital planning mode. We plan to be out in Gatesville in early April, where we'll be taking some GIS or GPS points, and we'll be working with Bill's staff to get some extra information in the asset inventory, and then be working towards moving that to a long-term capital plan. So Bill,
Heather, for whatever it's worth, if you noticed on the asset inventory that we've got, what quickly got my attention was pieces of equipment with a 15-year life cycle that are currently 27 years old, and then you look at the price beside it. So it clearly indicates the magnitude of the challenge that we're looking at right now.
Exactly. So there's some, like as he was saying, that sometimes we have things that are way past their useful life. Here's just one example. The belt press says its expected useful life is 15 years, but its age is 20. So it's -5 in terms of remaining useful life. So I think that's the kind of thing Bill's talking about, where it kind of gets your attention, that it looks like the price put in here is $250,000. So it's the kind of thing where you're looking at a piece of equipment that's worth, $250,000, and it's already 5 years past its useful life. So those are the kind of things that I think would tend to get somebody's attention, that, oops, we've got quite a lot of stuff. We call that our backlog. And Gatesville is not alone. Just as an example, the Albuquerque Authority's backlog was something like a couple $100 million. So it's not unusual to have a bunch of equipment because you haven't made the investments over time. There's a lot of equipment that's kind of past its, expiration date, if you will. So that's sort of that initial backlog of stuff that you have to do just to get you back to the, kind of ground zero, and then you move forward from there. So I think those would definitely be a focus in the capital improvement planning process of, which items are kind of past the expiration date, if you will.
Mm-hmm. And we're looking forward to your visit, Heather.
Great. All right, anything else?
Nope. I'll need to leave you at this particular point if I can, but we'll catch up down the road.
That sounds great. Well, thank you very much for being on, Bill, and safe travels this afternoon.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, Heather.
Okay, so moving on to Johnston. So what we have on screen right now is Johnston, Iowa. And Johnston, Iowa is a little bit bigger than Gatesville. The current population is just under 21,000 people. Their situation in terms of infrastructure is a little bit different. They get their water from the Des Moines Water Works, so it's like a regional water supplier, so they don't have to treat any water, they just distribute it. And they have their wastewater treated by the Des Moines Metropolitan Wastewater Reclamation Authority, so again, a regional wastewater treatment plant. So on the water and wastewater side, the city of Johnston is just running the collection system and the distribution system, but they also have a very extensive stormwater management system where they have some holding ponds, they have a lot of pipe infrastructure, they have some very interesting bottomless manholes, and if anybody is dealing with stormwater, you should talk to Johnston because they've come up with some very unique ways of addressing the stormwater in some of the areas they're just now serving with water, wastewater, and stormwater. They've come up with some very interesting techniques there. And moving on to some pictures of their assets, there's some pictures of some water, wastewater, and stormwater assets, just to again give you a feel for what some of the things are like in Johnston. With that, I will turn it over for a few minutes to Shane if you want to talk a little bit about your asset management program thus far, what you guys have done, what you're hoping to do, that sort of thing.
Well, the thing we want to get with asset management is we wanted to be able to more efficiently make our decisions regarding maintenancing of the assets. That's the biggest thing, is efficiency and effectiveness, trying to know where to spend the money. We are right now working with WaterCARE, trying to figure out a way to manage our data. We have a lot of information. We do closed television sewer inspections, so the sewer cameras. We have a lot of that data. We have hydrants. We have a lot of information on our hydrants, how often they've been maintained, and also on our valves. So our biggest thing we're kind of stuck at, I shouldn't say stuck at, but working on, is just trying to manage the data that we have. I don't know if anybody else want to add anything else to that regarding where we're at on asset management. So that's basically what I have right now, Heather.
Okay. All right, so let me just show a couple of screenshots of some of the things that Johnston has. Again, it's very similar to Gatesville in that they're not starting from ground zero. And as Shane mentioned, they do have quite a bit of data, so it's not like we're starting with nothing. There's actually a really extensive ArcGIS mapping system, and we were fortunate enough to have Shane walk us through the mapping system that they have, and it's clear that it does a lot of really good things for them, so it creates a really good starting place for Johnston because it's a very extensive system. You can see now some of the assets added to the base GIS map, and then if we zoom in, here's just a closer up shot of some of the information that they have in the GIS map. On maybe more of the opportunities for improvement side, let's put it that way. If you click on the details, like there's one for the hydrant valves and one for the hydrants themselves, There is some information in there, but there certainly needs to be a little bit more information to make it as useful as it could be for the folks in Johnston. So a great starting place, but we just need to add some information to the inventory to make it a little bit more robust and make it a little bit easier for the folks in Johnston to use it. And then here's some example information from the hydrant assets. And they actually have a pretty good set of information on hydrants, but many of the other assets don't have quite this level of information. So again, it's sort of just building off of what they have already and adding to it. And the positive thing for Johnston is they don't have to worry about the wastewater or water treatment plant portion, just the distribution portion. So it's limits the assets a little bit. There's still quite a few, but we don't have to worry about the treatment assets, just the field. So adding to, say, the hydrant asset data to include other things, you know, valves and other, you know, tanks, other types of assets will really benefit Johnston. They, similarly to Gatesville, have a fixed asset database, but there is limited information. Just as I mentioned before, it's sort of the same sort of deal where the fixed asset inventories are not created for the same purpose as what we want the asset information for. Typically what cities want the fixed asset information is they have to track it, they have to depreciate it, they have to keep it on the books and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a different purpose than what we want it for, but again, it creates a starting place. It gives us information to work with. And then there is some information on event histories for some activities, but I think, as Shane mentioned, like getting more information in there about activities they've done, maintenance work, repairs will really help them going forward to make better decisions about where to invest their money. So for Johnston, there's going to be an opportunity to provide some training. We're focusing on 3 areas right now. The asset inventory, trying to work with what's already there and create, you know, a more robust asset inventory. Level of service, to work with Johnston to develop some level of service goals and target levels, measuring that sort of thing. And then criticality being another big one, because making decisions really entails some understanding of, you know, what are the highly critical aspects of the water utility so that they know where to spend their money. So our goals would be a more robust asset inventory, you know, including additional asset data such as having an asset ID for each asset. The GIS system right now gives a number, but it's something that can change as you add different assets, so we need a fixed ID number that won't change. Condition information, age, useful life, replacement cost, etc. Some of that information is in there, but it needs to be expanded and additional information added. Then the level of service goals, as I mentioned, ranking the assets according to their probability of failure and consequence, so that then we can create that criticality ranking and give an idea of how much of their inventory is in different kinds of criticality. And then we'd like to present some knowledge management options as well. This is going to be a bigger issue for Haynes that we're going to talk about in a minute, but at least let Johnston know what kind of knowledge management options are out there so that if they want to institute any of those, they can do that. As I mentioned, we have a really good starting place with a very good GIS database that will allow us to expand and work from there. So we aren't starting from ground zero, which is great. We're just building off the existing information that's there. Shane, is there anything you or anybody else would like to add for Johnston?
No, the only thing I would is, like I said, we're the newer community, so we've kind of gone from a fast-growing community, so we were managing the growth, to managing infrastructure now, the long-term maintenance of it, kind of looking at a different perspective. So I think this will do a good job of helping us be able to meet those needs.
Great. And the activities will kick off in Johnston, I think mid-April is the beginning, and it'll be kicking off on asset inventory. So it'll about a month, things will be kicking off and be going in high gear after that.
I'm looking
Well,
forward
thank you,
to
Shane.
it.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to Haines. And if you've never had the chance to go to Haines, when you're up in Alaska the next time, you should visit it. It's a beautiful community. And it's very remote, not the easiest place to get to. So that creates its own kind of challenges for running a water and wastewater utility, because there's, mostly access by boat or by plane, not a lot of access by driving to Haines. So that creates some issues of, when you're looking at bringing facilities or equipment to the area, that creates some challenges. And here's a picture of some of the assets in Haines. Haines has, I didn't mention, Haynes's population is quite a bit smaller than Gatesville or Johnston, about 2,500 people. And they have a couple of different sources of drinking water. They have a surface water treatment plant. And the picture in the upper right-hand corner is the source for that treatment facility. They have a couple of wells that serve a very few customers, and then they have a spring-fed system that they've just newly put in a treatment system for that. They also operate a wastewater treatment plant, and because it's so cold in Alaska, the treatment plant has to be completely enclosed inside a building. So that creates some real significant challenges because they're near the ocean, so they have the ocean air kind of creating some potential for corrosion, but they also have, with the wastewater treatment plant, they have wastewater corrosion-related issues, so that creates some real challenges in trying to keep the equipment from corroding, keep the building from corroding. So that's been a real issue going forward, and they're looking at some capital improvement projects related to the wastewater treatment plant and making some improvements there. So I would like to open it up to Gila and Scott and Holly to talk about activities in Haines or what's going on in Haines right now.
Yeah, this is Scott Bradford. I'm the lead operator here in Haines, and some of our projects this year, like you mentioned, we're getting a new building on our sewer treatment plant. The existing one's 31 years old, and it literally is dissolving around itself, so it's a critical asset. And that's our big project for this summer. We have pretty limited maps and mapping in our system, and we're hoping to correct that. We don't have a good list of our assets, so we're hoping that we can correct that in the future. And funding.
Okay. Holly or Gila, anything you'd like to add?
Just that Scott's been with us for 20, how many years now?
29.
29 years, and he keeps talking about retirement, although we try and ignore him when he does that, but a lot of the information's in Scott's head. I mean, he knows where every valve is and every pipe in the ground, but it's just, we need to embark on employing Holly to get the information out of Scott's brain and into a database, I guess.
Yep, that's one of our major goals for Haines. And I will mention the day before I went to Haines, Scott was receiving the Operator of the Year award, and I forget, was that your water or wastewater one last year?
Wastewater.
Wastewater. So Scott has actually won Water Operator of the Year in Alaska, as well as last year he won the Wastewater Operator of the Year. So pretty high honors, and so I can see why the concern is there that, if they actually let him retire, which we're hoping maybe they won't, that creates a real issue of trying to get that information out of Scott's head before he walks out the door. And that is a big part of what we would like to do with the asset management program in Haines, and that's one reason I put the slide prior in that earlier portion about knowledge management, because it is really important when you have somebody who has all that knowledge to put it in another format. There's no way to get all of the knowledge that Scott has, but at least a big chunk of it would be really helpful. So as was mentioned, there is some limited GIS mapping. So Haines has actually done a pretty good job of mapping the community, getting parcel information, that sort of thing. There are some of the water and wastewater assets on there, pump stations, manholes, cleanouts, sewer mains, water mains, and hydrant legs. So there is some information. We'll zoom in a little bit and you can see, it's a little bit hard to see, but there's some lines on the screen there. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving, but I'm trying to sort of trace out some of the lines that are on the map. So as Scott mentioned, we'd like to add to this map. So we're actually going to be going to Haines in late May, early June to work with Scott and his crew to kind of fill in some more of this map so that they'll have information as much as possible about where assets are located. Kind of, again, having a good starting place really helps. So there's already a base map. We don't have to create that. We're just going to add to it. So we're going to take some GPS equipment and really add to the assets that are already in the base map, put the assets that are missing, correct anything. If Scott knows of something, you know, maybe it's not correctly drawn on the GIS map now, trying to fix those pieces and trying to get as much information into the current GIS system as we can. Again, there are some asset information available from the fixed asset inventory. Again, it gives us a great starting place. There's also some existing paper records that we can use that will help us fill in some asset information. So we're hoping to spend a pretty significant amount of time digging into the data, getting as much asset information as we can into the database, and also working on the knowledge management piece. So we're really going to focus on the asset inventory and the knowledge management. So as we're doing our field work, one of the activities we're going to be doing is trying to gain data out of Scott's head as much as possible through some videos, writing stuff down, photographs, kind of several different techniques to really try to get as much as we can, because I think he's in year 29 of a 30 years that he'd like to work, so we've got to move quick to try to get as much as we can. So again, our goals would be a more robust asset inventory, more complete GIS map, so that as new operators come on in the future, they'll have as complete a map as possible so that it will help them find the assets. And then a knowledge management program that can be used to help capture knowledge from Scott, you know, before he walks out the door with all that wealth of information. We have a good starting place again. As in the case of all of the communities, we have really good existing data from Excel, paper records, and then our goal will be working on the field data. So we do want to mention that there are some resources that help with asset management. We have a website, the southwestefc.unm.edu. There's also efcnetwork.org that has some information. We have a resource page. We're also going to be adding additional content. There's a lot of, we have an asset management manual. We have an asset management IQ tool. We have different databases and things that people can access. So there are quite a lot of resources. And there's also a lot of resources on other people's websites. The American Water Works Association has an asset management web page that has a lot of resources. EPA has a lot of resources. And many states have their own resources. So there's quite a bit of information out there. So anybody who's not getting direct asset management assistance through WaterCARE, if you'd like to pursue any of these activities, there's quite a bit of information to help you. So in summary, asset management is a way of thinking about assets and how to manage them, and it can benefit any system, and it can be used on any set of assets. So water, wastewater, stormwater is kind of the primary focus of WaterCARE, but if in your community you deal with other kinds of assets, buildings, libraries, parks, roads, etc. It's just a way of thinking about assets, so it really doesn't matter what kind of assets you manage. Asset management works. Just as an example, on Thursday I'll be training senior citizen centers. I've been doing it for 4 years now. I do asset management training for them. Their assets deal with, kitchen equipment, dining equipment, vehicles, buildings, that kind of thing. But it's the same sort of process. We just transfer it over to the types of assets that they deal with. So it's very easy to apply it to other assets. So if in your job you deal with more than just water and wastewater assets, there's no reason you can't take the techniques you learn in water and wastewater and apply them to other assets. With that, I'd like to open it up to see if anybody has any questions for any of the utilities that talked, or any questions about asset management. You can either type in the chat box if that works easier for you, or raise your hand, push the raise your hand icon, and we'll open your phone line up so that you can talk to the folks who spoke, or ask me a question about asset management. And I'll also put some contact information up there right now from myself and Don Knoll, who's a colleague who's also on the line right now. We handle much of the asset management activities for the Southwest EFC. So do we have any questions? As of now, we don't have any questions. I will throw it back just for a moment to David and Sonia from the EPA headquarters to see if either of them want to add anything. They're kind of from the EPA end in charge of the WaterCARE Communities project, so we're just going to unmute David and Sonia, see if they have anything to add while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions.
Heather, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was a great presentation about the benefits of asset management. I think one thing that all of WaterCARE is interested in is, kind of continuing to drive home the point about the financial benefits to asset management. So I think that was really good to see. And yeah, I know just from sitting in on prior conversations we've had with Shane and Johnston and the team up in Haines, I think there's a lot of good work going on, and everybody's excited about that. So I don't have anything more to add than that. I'm not sure if Sonia is muted or if she can add anything, but
I think Sonia is muted and didn't enter PIN, so we won't
okay.
We won't open it up to Sonia then. Last call for anybody that has any questions or comments. Just raise your hand and. So we had one comment that the three systems, that they liked the presentations from the three systems, and I would like to add my thanks to the folks from Gatesville, Haines, and Johnston for being willing to share their experiences. And interestingly, we thought that perhaps the starting points were quite a bit different from the three communities, but it turns out they're actually more similar than we thought. So the direction we're going to go in the three communities is a little bit different based on people's needs. But we have, kind of similar starting places where we have, maybe some communities a little bit better mapping than others, but everybody has at least a little bit of mapping, and then everybody has just at least a little bit of information in their inventory. Looks like we have a question from Vince. We're going to unmute you, Vince, and you're free to talk to us now.
Yeah, I think somebody already addressed it. Is there going to be, are these slides going to be made available?
Yes. You should receive a copy of a PDF version. The slides, because of having all those GIS screenshots and etc., the PowerPoint is gigantic.
Yeah.
So it isn't able to be shared via email because I can't get it out of my shop, but we have a PDF version of the slides. If you need a version that is more of the PowerPoint version, let me know and I can share it through Google Drive or some other mechanism. But you should get, right after this, you should get the PDF version of all the slides.
Well, that'll do. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're right about quitting time. We're 2 minutes early, so how's that for being on time? So I want to thank you all again for being on today. Just as a reminder, one more time, we have our next WaterCARE community conversation on the 19th that will be focusing on affordability. And there's quite a few communities, if not just about everybody, that has an affordability concern of one type or another. So that should be something that all communities should be interested in. And then we have September 19th will be another community conversation on customer communication, rate communication. So again, that's something that should be near and dear to just about everybody's heart, because everybody has to deal with how do you communicate rates, how do you deal with your customers. So join us for those two opportunities. Thank you all for being on today. We appreciate your taking the time to be with us today, and have a good rest of your day.